Welcome back to the second video for Thursday, January 28th. In this video, we're going to talk about the instructions for Lab 3, which is hardness testing. And this is what you're going to do when you come into the lab on next Tuesday, February 2nd. So when you come into the lab, first of all, make sure that you're wearing a mask. In order to be in the building in Turner Hall, you have to wear a mask. The only reason I'm allowed to not be wearing a mask right now is because I'm in my office. But whenever I go out into the hallway, I wear a mask. That's the rules of being in a campus building. So make sure you're wearing a mask. Also, when you're in the lab, make sure you bring your safety glasses and wear your safety glasses when you're in the lab. This is probably the first lab where it's not totally ridiculous to have to wear safety glasses because the indenters that we're using have a really small surface area. It's like a point that is pressing down on the specimen. So occasionally it does happen where the specimen can kind of fall apart or break apart or even fly apart. So you want to make sure that your eyes are protected. That's very unlikely to happen, but just in case it does, it's a good practice to be in. So you got to wear a mask. You got to wear safety glasses where you're in the lab. Also, try to stay 6 feet apart. We want to try to remain socially distanced as much as we can. So that shouldn't be a big problem. There's enough room in there. We don't have that many people in there in each lab group. So we should be able to remain kind of socially distanced. Also, we're not going to be in there for very long either. Each group is not going to be in there for very long. So try to maintain socially distanced separation of 6 feet as much as you can. The lab is room 122. It's the plastics lab. It's probably easiest for you to come in via the classroom, which is room 124C, which is kind of down an awkward, weird little ramp off of the main hallway in the building. It's on the south side of the building, on the west side, closer to Redbird Arena. So kind of in the southwest corner of the building. You go down a little ramp, you'll see this little hallway off of the main hallway. You go down the ramp, and near the end of the ramp is room 124C. It's probably easiest if you wait for your group members in there in room 124C, and then the actual testing is going to take place in the plastics lab, room 122. So there's going to be 2 stations in the plastics lab. There's going to be 1 station at the Rockwell automatic hardness testing machine. And that's probably where I will be. That's where I will station myself, just in case there are any questions that come up about how to operate the Rockwell testing machine. It's pretty straightforward, and the instructions, I think, are pretty good in the lab manual. But even so, I'm kind of there as a safety supervisor to make sure that you're being safe when you do the lab, and also if you have any questions, I'm there to help you out as well. So that'll be 1 station. And then the other station will be in some of the tables in the main area of the plastics lab. You'll see what I mean when you get in there. In the main room of the plastics lab, I'll have the plastic specimens with the durometers, the Shore D durometer on it for you to do those. So it doesn't really matter which order you do those in. Usually it's most natural or intuitive to do the Rockwell testing first and then do the Shore testing after that, but it doesn't really matter. All right, so I think we're just about ready to go ahead and step through the instructions. What I'd really recommend you do is get out your lab manual right now and follow along. Oftentimes it's kind of difficult for the camera to focus really well on these instructions. So it's going to be a lot easier for you to follow along if you have your lab manual out and follow along by reading along with me as I talk through the instructions. So we're going to start on page 27 of the lab manual. So I'm going to flip over to the document camera and let's start talking through these instructions. All right, so before we get started, I don't know how well you could see the indenters before. I don't know how well you can see them now either, but this is the Rockwell C indenter. It's called a diamond braille. A diamond braille just means like a diamond cone. So it comes to a sharp point. And this is the Rockwell B indenter. It's got a 1/16 inch diameter ball on the end. And I don't know how well you can see that with this webcam, but you'll see it. It looks significantly different than the Diamond Braille indenter, and this is what you use for Rockwell B testing. This one we're not going to use, but I just brought it for show and tell. This is the Rockwell R test that you could use for Rockwell testing, for hardness testing of plastic materials, but we're not actually going to do that one. And then these are the durometers. We're going to do D scale testing. We're not going to use this one, but it's basically the same thing, just a different scale, calibrated a little bit differently. All right, so for Lab 3, there's two sections. This first section is for the Rockwell testing with the Instron automatic hardness testing machine. First of all, for your lab report, make sure you list all of the specimens. In a bullet format is fine. So list all of the metals that you're going to test, list all the plastics that you're going to test for the shore testing. Bullet format is fine. This section doesn't have to be in complete sentences. And then for your procedure section, you're going to describe in your own words everything that you're going to do. It might take a paragraph or two to describe this for the different tests. So the power for the machine, it's going to be on. I'll get it set up. And there's a button that has a bar graph with an X through it near the upper right of the console with the digital screen on it. That clears out the previous data. Click OK. And by the way, you should have this when you come into the lab. I'm not going to be telling you what to do step by step. You should have this paper, your lab manual, with you so that you can read through the instructions step by step. And then you want to make sure that you're selecting the appropriate testing scale. It doesn't matter whether you do Rockwell B tests first or the Rockwell C test first. It doesn't matter. I'd probably recommend using whichever indenter happens to be in the machine at that time. So probably whatever scale the previous group did last, that's probably the scale that you want to start with. But you need to press the button on the console of the machine that says scale, and then select the appropriate scale, either B or C, HRB or HRC. And then press OK, and then it should say ready for test 1. And then you want to make sure you have the proper indenter in the machine. If you don't, then there's a little thumb screw that you turn. You take the other indenter out, and then you put the correct indenter in, and then tighten up the thumb screw, just like installing a drill bit in a drill press. And, okay, so make sure you have the right indenter. Then you press, or you place the specimen on the test pedestal. And then you saw those arrows that I pointed out in the previous video. So you want to move the test head, the indenter, up and down until the indenter is about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch away from the specimen. Otherwise, you just have to sit there for a long time and just wait for the indenter to slowly come down until it makes contact with the specimen. So to make it not take all day, you want to move it down to 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch above the specimen. And then once you've selected the right scale on the machine and you have the right indenter in the machine and you've moved the indenter down close to the specimen, then you press the green start button. That's down below the specimen. Press the green button and then wait, like I said, about 10, maybe 15 seconds for it to do its job. It's going through that 5-step procedure that we talked through in the first video. And then when it's done, it's going to read out the value on the LCD screen, and you need to record that for your lab report. You need to do that test 3 times on each specimen. That's in the ASTM procedure. And each time you do the test, you want to move the specimen around a little bit so you're not testing at the same point on the specimen, and then record each value. All right, so the tests. So you need to do the Rockwell B test on aluminum 6061, on aluminum 7075, on brass and on the steel 1045. And then what you need to do is do the Rockwell C test, and the Rockwell C test is only on the 1045 steel. So you do all of these with the Rockwell B test, and then just for comparison, basically, between the scales, I want you to do this one with the Rockwell C scale also. Then you change out the specimen and repeat. Go back to the first step in this section and repeat this procedure for each specimen. So remember, each time you do a test, you do 3 tests on each specimen, and then once you're done, for your data analysis, you're going to take the average of those data points. All right, so that is the data collection for the Rockwell hardness testing machine. Then this one with the Shore D test, the Shore D durometer, you can do this before the Rockwell test if you get there a little bit early and if you have enough time before the test. Be patient. It's going to take a little bit of time, so be patient with each other. And you can do this before the Rockwell test or immediately after. That's fine. So you can use the durometer. This is pretty straightforward. You lay the plastic sample that I'm going to have out on those tables, lay it on a sturdy surface, press it into the specimen at a perpendicular angle until it won't go anymore, and then record the maximum value with that red needle that I pointed out in the first video. And then this too, you need to perform this test 3 times and on each specimen and move it to a different location on the specimen each time, record each value, and then you're going to take an average once you get to the data analysis. And you've got 5 different polymer plastic materials that I want you to test. And then once you're done, there's a storage box. I didn't show you that before, but this is a storage box for the durometer. And once you're done, just put it back in the storage box. That way it doesn't get dropped on the floor or something. For results, so in a table, I want you to show all the experimentally obtained results, all the data that you get. Show me all your data in a table. Probably 2 tables, 1 table for the Rockwell data and 1 table for the Shore D data. And then it could be the same table or it could be a different table. Take the average of the 3 tests that you did on each specimen and show the average hardness value for each of the materials. Then I want you to create a bar graph showing the average hardness value for each of the Rockwell B scale tests. Don't do the Rockwell C test for the bar graph because you only did the Rockwell C test on 1 material, the 1045 steel. So it doesn't really make sense to do a bar graph if you're not comparing it to anything. So don't worry about the Rockwell C test for this bar graph. Just do the bar graph for Rockwell B scale tests. Then do the same thing, a bar graph for the Shore D scale tests. So 2 bar graphs. And then for the discussion section, answer these in complete sentence. I want you for each test method, for the Rockwell test method and for the Shore test method, write a paragraph or so summarizing how each test is performed. All right, so here's a hint. What I'll be looking for in here, you should summarize those 5 steps that we talked about that are part of the Rockwell testing procedure. That was in the first video. Okay, so you should do that. A brief description of both of the testing methods for Rockwell and for Shore testing. Number 2 are some applications. Which test would you use and why for a rubber tire or for a titanium bicycle frame? Explain why for both cases. And then number 3, find a diagram that qualitatively shows the relationship between the scales. And this is about slide 5 in the slides that I went through in the first video. And see if these make sense. See if your values for testing of the 1045 steel, which you did for Rockwell B and C, see if those match up using the scales. So do they make sense? Why or why not? Explain why or why not. And the last part in the discussion section of your lab report, I want you to make a scatter plot for these plastic specimens that you performed SURE-D testing on. So you have your SURE-D data, and I'm giving you down here, I'm giving you the Rockwell R hardness testing, which Rockwell R is for plastics also. We didn't do it, but that's fine. But this is the Rockwell hardness value, approximately for each of these specimens that you did the SURE-D testing on. So what I want you to do is do a scatter plot. Like, it's going to look kind of like this, where the SURE-D hardness is on the horizontal axis, and the Rockwell R hardness that I'm giving you here is on the vertical axis. And then you need to create a best fit trend line, which is like a regression, and show the equation and give the equation for the best fit trend line between these two data sets. All right, so there should be a pretty reasonable correlation between these two. As you get higher readings in the SURE-D hardness, that should correlate to higher readings for Rockwell R hardness as well. All right, once again, make sure, as usual, make sure you have a title, make sure your axes have labels and units, and make sure that you label your plot with a figure number. For example, figure 1, SURE-D hardness versus Rockwell R hardness for 5 selected materials. It doesn't have to be exactly that, but there should be a figure number, and then you can refer to that as seen in figure 1 as you're describing this in the discussion section of your lab report. Okay, that's it for Lab 3. It's a pretty straightforward lab, but if there are any questions at all, don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. I'll be happy to answer any questions. That's what I'm here for. Make sure that when you come into the building next week, make sure you've got a mask on. When you do the lab, make sure you have your safety glasses to wear. Stay socially distanced, 6 feet apart as much as you can. And just be patient, you know, because I think I'm going to set the times to be staggered so that you won't have to wait very much. But just in case, if you get into the classroom 124C and the previous group is not done yet, then just be patient and wait a little bit, and it'll go pretty smoothly, I think. All right, so that's it. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you next week for Lab 3.